When you're talking about the women's rights movement, you have to start in 1848 at Seneca Falls, New York, where on July 19th and 20th, Elizabeth Cady Stanton brought women and men together to talk about why women were treated so unjustly in American society and try to come up with arguments for why they should be treated better and a plan for how to get these changes made. Now, she used the Declaration of Independence to craft her Declaration of Sentiments, and she starts by saying, "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards woman, having a direct object the establishment of absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world." Then she talks basically about how women weren't allowed to vote, and women had to submit to laws when they actually had no voice in creating those laws, that married women had no property rights, that basically men had legal, power over their wives, that divorce and child custody favored men. Women had to pay property taxes, yet again, they didn't get to be making those decisions. Classic, no taxation without representation. Many occupations were closed to women, and then if they did get to work, they got paid only a fraction of what men got. That many sort of higher status occupations were totally closed to women. They couldn't really get an education because no college or university would accept women students. Women couldn't really participate in the church. All of this was to say that women were robbed of their self confidence and self respect and basically couldn't be independent of men. Now, she said, we insist that women have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States. This is this declaration of independence, part two in many ways, saying we can't have women just be dependent on men forever. Now, the convention goes well, and the Declaration of Sentiments and 12 other resolutions receive unanimous endorsement. But there's one that doesn't, and that's the one that calls for women's enfranchisement or women's suffrage. And frankly, at the time there was people being very concerned that if you asked for this, you'd get some real backlash. And it was actually Frederick Douglass, the black abolitionist and great speaker and writer. And he said, you know what? Women, like the slave, he argued, had the right to liberty. And again, if you think about it, he says, suffrage is the power to choose rulers and make laws, and the right by which all others are secured. Now, if you think about it, blacks weren't able to vote at that point in time. Women weren't able to vote, and so there was this kinship between women's rights and abolitionists. Now, ultimately, when it comes to the 15th Amendment that is ratified, giving black males the right to vote, many women suffragettes feel incredibly betrayed by this because the thinking was is that they'd been working together to secure rights for both minority groups. Now, the Declaration of Sentiments sort of gets at something that becomes very, very true. It's actually quite prophetic. It says, "In entering upon the great work before us, we anticipate no small amount of misconception, misrepresentation, and ridicule, but we shall use every instrumentality within our power to effect our object. We shall employ agents, circulate tracts, which are pamphlets, petition the state and national legislatures, and endeavor to enlist the pulpit, again, ministers, and the press in our behalf. We hope this convention will be followed by a series of conventions embracing every part of the country." The reason this is so interesting is because clearly they do face a ton of resistance going through this quote unquote first wave of feminism and definitely in the second wave of feminism later in the 20th century. Now, the women's rights movement did actually have a bunch of conventions after that and going all the way up really through the war. And if you're going to think about actually after the war, you've got sort of a continuation of the spirit of Seneca Falls. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, a woman named Lucy Stone, Sojourner Truth, who was, again, a former slave, so had sort of this, interesting perspective of being a black woman and a very tall woman at that. And so they're going to push towards, the end of of the 19th century around issues like suffrage, which we'll certainly talk about as really the major issue that you're going to see during that Gilded Age. Now, Wyoming is the first territory to grant suffrage during Reconstruction, actually, in 1869, and then they're the first state in 1889. And you have to remember, like we've talked about, women's suffrage really moves from west to east. Women had way more opportunity in the West and much more independence, so it's not surprising that you saw that. And in fact, it's, as we are going to, see it play out with NASA and looking more for trying to go state to state to state and being sort of far more conservative versus National Women's Party led by Alice Paul, which is really much more radical and trying to get a national amendment just to sort of solve it all. And of course, we've talked about how in many ways, the 19th Amendment, which was granted in 1920, was given by Wilson sort of to the more conservative NASA and sort of saying, thank you, women, for all your support. No mention of the fact that Alice Paul had, of course, been forced fed in jail after she protested in front of the White House. So actually, when the 19th Amendment is secured, which is really, truly, the greatest achievement for women's rights up until that point, you're going to see that women's rights movement sort of go in different directions. And in 1919, what you're going to see is they're going to go from from NASA is going to sort of rebrand itself as the League of Women Voters, which is still around today, to make sure that women could sort of use that hard-earned vote seriously. In some ways, like you saw with the Union League coming down from the north to south to sort of help African Americans who can now vote be part of the political process. That's what the League of Women Voters has done. You're also in 1920 going to see the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor to establish and gather information about women at work and to advocate for changes if needed. And again, being able to monitor and help women in the workplace, certainly something in the 1920s, despite the fact that we know that most women went home after World War I, there still are a larger percent of women that are working now than have ever worked before. And then Alice Paul, of course, who had been the leader of the National Women's Party, she drafted the Equal Rights Amendment and that she wanted to get passed in the Constitution. And for her, if you had a federal, protection like this, she said, men and women would have equal rights to the United States. And she said, you know what, this is what we need. We need it actually enshrined in the Constitution. Also in the 1920s, what we're going to see is the rise of the birth control movement. And again, we know the name Margaret Sanger with that. And for her, the idea of a woman's right to control her own body and to control her own reproduction and sexuality added a new dimension to this idea of women's independence. Now, it didn't just talk about endorsing this idea of educating women about birth control methods. It also spread the conviction that there was basically a meaningful freedom for women if they could decide for themselves if they would become mothers and when they wanted to do that. And at the same time, you have to understand that Margaret Sanger is really promoting this idea that sex can be something that women could enjoy. It doesn't have to just be for reproduction, and that women can actually have a relationship with their husbands that is about enjoying sex and not just being, we need to have kids. And now in 1936, you're going to see a Supreme Court decision that declassifies birth control information as obscene. That means that up until that point, you couldn't really even talk about it, or else you could run afoul of obscenity laws. However, it's not going to be until 3 more decades, in the mid-60s, where married couples in all states could obtain birth control legally. And we'll talk about that in the second wave of feminism right now. The 1960s feminism, known as the second wave, really can be traced back to Betty Friedan, who publishes this seminal book, The Feminine Mystique. And actually, this feminine mystique had come out of a survey that she had done for her 20-year college reunion. Again, this would have been somebody that was graduating from college back in the early 40s. Again, somebody who would have been born in the 20s. Sort of an interesting, if you sort of think about that in terms of, born early in the 20s, post-World War I, graduating during World War II, and sort of finding herself, age 40, 45 in the 60s. And she's talking in it about the emotional and intellectual oppression that middle-class educated women were experiencing because they didn't have the options. They looked around, they said, we've gone to great schools, and in fact, many of these women had gone to really outstanding women's colleges. Again, they were not allowed to go to men's colleges. Every, like Ivy League school had its own women's college, sort of sister school, if you will. And Betty Friedan, really stuns the nation by calling out what she says is, listen, you guys all think that housewives are content to stay with, our families. But you know what? Women need to seek fulfillment outside the home. And yes, her message was probably most directed to an audience of educated, upper middle class white women. But it really does have an impact sort of up and down sort of the socioeconomic strata. And the book becomes an immediate bestseller, sort of, again, your Uncle Tom's Cabin of the women's movement, and immediately inspired thousands of women to say, you know what? Why are we stuck at home? We could be doing so much more. We have the ability, we have the know how, and we need to just go out and do it. Now, we're going to look at a bunch of events and activities that provide more opportunities for women and also go after discrimination in the workplace. And in fact, that 1964 Civil Rights Act, which we talk so much about in terms of desegregating public facilities, particularly for racial minorities, actually has a piece in there that says you can't prohibit employment discrimination. I'm sorry, you can't discriminate on the basis of sex as well as race, religion, and national origin. So what we tend to think of is the discrimination based on race, but actually, quite cynically, congressmen who were against the law had put sex in there to try to make it so that the men wouldn't pass the bill. Oh my God, you can't do that. But actually, it did pass. And as a result, you're going to see an organization called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, known as the EEOC, which is established to investigate discrimination complaints. It's not just for women, it's again for anybody who'd be discriminated against in employment. And within those first 5 years that the commission is around, it receives 50,000 sex discrimination complaints. So, wow, it's like we're immediately seeing that people are quite upset about the way they're being treated at work. Now, unfortunately, much like we saw with like the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was designed, allegedly to help farmers going back after, they lost in Wabash, it's pretty clear that the commission is not actually very interested in pursuing these complaints. And so Betty Friedan, again, the writer of Feminine Mystique, and who's been very involved in organizations for women immediately after that, gets together with, various organizations and says, we need to form an organization much like sort of what the NAACP is for African Americans. So she said the only way that we're ever going to actually get anything done is if we have truly sort of an institutional push to be able to lobby government on our behalf and really to get the word out. So in 1966, NOW, or the National Organization for Women, is organized. And again, they're upset about how they're not getting what they feel that they were promised in the Civil Rights Act of '64. The EEOC is not doing what they want. They feel that employers are still discriminating against women. They're not paying women the same. So what they're going to do here is they're going to try to mobilize women. They're going to try to give women's rights advocates the power to put pressure on employers, put it on the government. And they really are going for full equality of the sexes. And they say, you know what, if we can increase the number of women attending colleges and attending graduate schools, if we can get them in professional jobs, not the pink collar jobs that we've seen in terms of secretarial work, if we can get them appointed to federal offices, and geez, if we could actually get them elected to office, things could really change. And really one of the great achievements legally was what we know Title IX, which is part of the Education Code of 1972, where they're going to open up equal access to higher education, professional schools, graduate schools, and really importantly, high school and collegiate athletics. Now, as a result of Title IX, you're going to see the number of women doctors and lawyers and engineers and architects double and double and double as these quotas that limited women's enrollment in graduate schools were outlawed. So before, it was like you can only take, 5% of a class could be women. Now all of a sudden they're getting rid of quotas. You see more access to opportunity for women. And of course, once given the opportunity, they show what they could always do and excel. Now, we tend to know Title IX much more in terms of athletics. So again, it was making sure that women had the opportunity to play high school and college sports, and very soon after that, you're going to see sort of a remarkable increase in terms of how interest in women's sports, college sports, women in the Olympics increases in a really impressive way. Okay,